Hey guys, it's Chris Bergstrom from BushidoPhoto.com, and today I'm going to talk to you about basic photography techniques to get you up to speed with your new camera. Stick around. Alright, so you just bought your new camera. It's a DSLR, it's a mirrorless camera, and it's got manual and automatic settings on it. And you want to know, what do these settings do? Well, there's only three things that affect your exposure when dealing with a camera. The three things are your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. Let's start off by talking about the shutter speed. So what is shutter speed? The shutter speed is the amount of time that your shutter actually opens, exposing the sensor, allowing light to gather and collect on that sensor, exposing your image. So if you're using a slow shutter speed, somewhere around between 1 second to 30 seconds, you're going to allow everything that's in the scene that's moving to be either invisible or to blur out. So for example, let's say you set up your camera on a tripod and you're aiming at a freeway. There's nothing on this freeway except a bunch of cars, right? And you're like, well, I want to take a shot that has just the freeway in it. Well, if you set your shutter speed to 30-second long exposure and you take an exposure and it's properly exposed with your aperture and your ISO, the actual cars, because they're all moving so fast, won't really show up on the final image. You'll see the road. You may see a little bit of blurring from the cars that were passing through the shot, but generally speaking, you're going to have nothing left on that freeway, just the blank, empty freeway. Another thing that's cool about slow shutter speeds is you can get star trails. So if you're shooting late at night and it's completely dark, you can set your camera pointing at the sky, and if you take like a 3-minute, 4-minute, 5-minute long exposure, these stars will start to trail. And if you take multiple exposures over and over again, you can actually stack them in Photoshop and create those amazing, long star trails where they never end or start. They're just a continuous line of the sky basically looking like it's spinning as the Earth rotates. Another cool thing you can do with your shutter speed is you can freeze motion. So if you have your shutter speed at a higher shutter speed, like 1/8,000th of a second, and there's somebody, a pitcher is throwing the ball and you take the shot, that is going to be completely frozen at 1/8,000th of a second. The same applies for hummingbird wings, basically anything that's moving. So what I recommend is, if you are shooting, if this is talking about airplane photography, so if you're shooting airplanes at air shows and whatnot, and they have props, old vintage World War II aircraft or modern aircraft that use propellers, what you don't want to do is shoot at a high shutter speed thinking that you want to freeze the airplane, because what you're going to end up doing is freezing the props on the plane, and it's going to look like the aircraft's engines are stalled and it's falling out of the sky. So I recommend having your shutter speed at around 1/100th to 1/60th of a second, and pan with the aircraft as it's moving along, and that will allow the propellers to make one full revolution and make it not look like it's falling out of the sky. So next up, we'll talk about your aperture. So what is your aperture? All right, so the way I think of the aperture is, if you look through the lens, you'll see these little aperture blades, and it's kind of like your iris in your eye. Your eye closes down completely round every time, and it's from all sides. Well, with an aperture, they actually usually have blades that intersect like this, and as they close down, they get more hexagonal shaped. And depending on how many blades your aperture actually has, will affect the shape of the bokeh. So you have the out of focus balls of light in the background. If the aperture is wide open at, like, let's say f1.4, those balls of light should be fairly round, if not completely round. If you're shooting at an aperture of 5.6 or f8, you're going to have the shape of the aperture blades. So that is one reason why I recommend, if you want to blur out the background, you want to use a lens from 50 millimeters up to 200 millimeters and shoot with an aperture of between f1.2 to f2.8, and that's going to really separate your subject from the background by blurring out the background. Currently, I'm shooting this video at f1.2, and in the background, it's actually got some texture on it, but it looks like it's, completely out of focus because of the shallow depth of field and the distance from me to the background. Now, let's say you're a landscape photographer and you want to have everything in focus. Then you're going to want to shoot between f8 and f16. That's going to have everything from near to far, pretty much to infinity in focus in your shot. But one word of warning is do not stop your aperture down to more than f16, like let's say f22, f32, because what you're going to get is a phenomenon called diffraction, and that's going to allow the light to bend as it crosses the very small aperture. It's a very small opening in the lens, and the light is going to bend around the edges of the corners of the aperture blades, and that is going to make your photo appear to be less in focus than if you had a smaller number on your aperture. The last tip about the aperture is a smaller number equals a wider aperture. I know some people may feel like this is counterintuitive or it's backwards, but just remember, if it's a small number, it means you are letting in more light. If it's a higher number, like f16 or f22, your aperture is almost the size of a pinhole, and most pinhole cameras are shooting at like f64 or even smaller than that, and those are the old school ways of shooting to try to get everything in focus with film cameras. A lot more to talk about on that. We just don't have time to do it right now. All right, the last thing I'll talk about your pyramid of exposure is your ISO. What is ISO? The ISO is the sensitivity of the camera's sensor to light. So think about if you shot with film in the old days, it's like your film speed. Now, instead of ASA, they call it the ISO. It's basically the same thing. If you're shooting with 100 speed film or 100 ISO on your camera, it's basically the same thing. It's how sensitive the image is going to pick up the light in the scene. This is going to allow you to have a slower or faster shutter speed depending on how sensitive you set your camera to. One word of warning, a caution on the ISO is the higher that you make the ISO, so let's say you're shooting at nighttime, the higher you set your ISO, the more noise you're going to introduce into this image. And it's a little different than film grain. And back in the old days with film, the grain was a neutral color. It was like a grayish, like somebody sprinkled pepper in your image. Well, with digital cameras, the actual film grain, or the noise, if you will, is actually color noise, and it's going to introduce magentas, greens, reds, little splotches all over the place. And if you, let's say you raise your ISO up to ISO 6400 or beyond, depending on how good your camera manufacturer is at shooting in low light, you may have a bunch of noise, and it may be a totally useless image where you just want to throw it away and you don't even want to use it. So what I recommend is find out where that point is where the images aren't going to be usable to your taste. So for me, with my Fujifilm cameras, I try to not shoot above ISO 3200. 6400 is completely acceptable, but I find that the color noise starts to introduce itself a little more than I personally like. So in those instances, when I am shooting with ISO 6400, I usually try to switch the image profile to black and white, and this allows the color noise to now just become like film grain. All right, so we'll talk about lens compression, stops of light, and lens focal lengths that you may have available to you. So first off, we'll start with lens compression. What is lens compression? So when you hear somebody say that, it's basically how the lens either expands the perspective, making things in the background look like they're further away, or bringing those things in closer, which is a really cool thing that you can actually do. So let's say you're shooting at 24 millimeters And this is pretty much a wide angle lens, standard wide angle. And you want to get everything in the shot. Well, what you have to keep in mind is your eyes see at roughly 50 millimeter focal length. So that's what they consider a normal lens. So when you use a 50 millimeter lens and you look around, the distance of things in the background compared to whatever the subject is that you're shooting will look like normal. So you may have something that's further away and it looks the same. Well, with a wide angle lens, it's going to look like the thing in the background is way back here, because you basically halved, cut in half your 50 millimeter lens and went down to a 24 millimeter. So that's going to push everything in the background twice as far away. Now, let's go back to the opposite end of that and go telephoto. So let's go from 50 millimeter to 100 millimeter lens. Now, everything in the background that at 24 millimeters looked like it was way back here is now going to be at 50 millimeters here. Well, with 100 millimeters, it's doubled in size. So you can compress that background, bringing things of interest, like let's say there's a castle up on the hill back here, and you've got a stream, some water coming down here and some flowers in the foreground. Now, instead of with a 24 millimeter lens, that little castle looking insignificant and far away, you're actually bringing it into the scene to where it's now a dominant piece of the photograph. So that's lens compression and perspective expansion by using wide angle lenses. Normal lens is the way your eyes see. Telephoto, the further you go out with the telephoto lenses, let's say 300 millimeters, the more you're going to bring that background in closer to your subject. All right, stops of light. So what's a stop of light? So if you're looking at your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed, let's start out with the ISO. This is kind of like your film speed. So if you go from ISO 100 and you double it to ISO 200, that is one stop of light. Now, if you go from ISO 200 to 400, that's doubling the sensitivity to the light. That's also one stop of light. 400 to 800, 800 to 1600, 16 to 32, 3200 to 6400, and so on. These are all one stops of light. And there's usually third stop increments built in between. So as you adjust your camera settings, you're going to see, ISO 100, 160, 2 something, whatever, and then it's going to be third stops in between. So that means 3 clicks on your camera. So every time you adjust the knob 3 times, that's one stop of light. So take a photo outdoors at what your camera thinks is proper exposure. Adjust the camera up by 1 stop, which is 3 clicks. Take the photo and then go down 3 stops or 3 clicks again, and then go the opposite direction by 3 clicks. So now you're actually underexposed by 1 stop, and take a photo. And now pull them up on your computer side by side, and you're going to say, okay, this one's properly exposed from what the camera thinks, and then these are underexposed by a stop and overexposed by a stop. And just compare them, and that exposure difference, up or down, is going to be 1 stop of light. All right, focal lengths. So lens focal lengths, typically what I recommend if you're trying to shoot portraits is you're going to want to shoot between 50 millimeters, 85 millimeters, 100, 105, and 135 millimeter, sometimes out to 200. These are going to keep the facial features of your subject that you're shooting the way that they look pretty much naturally. The longer you go, so like let's say 200, 300 millimeters, the flatter you're going to make the face. So these ears are going to actually look like they're right next to their head. It's going to flatten the image, may or may not look good for your particular subject. Now let's go to the opposite extreme. If you're shooting with a wide angle lens and you're trying to shoot, a headshot of somebody, and you bring that wide angle 24 millimeter lens right up in their face, their nose is going to look huge. Their ears are going to look stretched out. You're going to have a cone head as it stretches up to the top of the frame. Their chin's going to look all stretched out, and it's just not going to be flattering. So if you're going to use a wide angle lens, use it with some space in between the top of the subject and the bottom of the subject, as well as the sides, to keep their perspective. If this is your frame, you want to have the subject in the center, off to one side using the rule of thirds, which I'll talk about on the next episode. You want to have them, somewhere in the center, but not too close to the top or the bottom, because that's going to stretch them out and make them look really funky. Unless that's the look you're going for, but at least know the photography rules so that you can break them. All right, guys, so that brings us to the end of Photography 101. If you have any questions about how to use your camera, you don't understand anything about what ISO does, what your aperture does, or what your shutter speed does in that pyramid of exposure, please comment down below, and I will always answer anybody who leaves a comment down below. Thank you. Click like and subscribe, and if you didn't like this video, click it twice. Thank you, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.